This story is about the screaming train. It was a cold autumn evening, and the last train had just arrived at the station. Julian, a young man who often traveled late at night due to his demanding job, was waiting on the platform. The subway car screeched to a halt, its wheels crying out with an echo that sent chills down his spine. He was used to these late-night commutes, but tonight felt different, and he couldn't quite put his finger on it. It was as if the entire platform was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Julian boarded the train, and the doors closed behind him with a hissing whisper. He sat down, but something about the way the lights flickered caught his attention. Each time they blinked, he could almost swear he saw shadows moving in ways that defied logic. Trying to brush off the feeling, he put on his headphones and leaned back. Halfway through his commute, Julian felt an icy breeze that made him shiver. Confused, he looked around, but none of the windows were open. The air felt colder, and he rubbed his hands together, trying to warm himself. Suddenly, his music cut off, and his headphones let out a static hum. He pulled them off, and that's when he heard it. A blood-curdling scream echoed through the car, louder than anything he'd ever heard. It was so piercing that his heart began to race. Julian stood up, trying to locate the source, but everyone around him was still. Some were even asleep. Another scream. This time, it came from the far end of the car, followed by a chilling laugh that echoed down the aisle. The other passengers began to stir, confusion and fear evident on their faces. Julian felt his legs trembling as he moved toward the sound, driven by some inexplicable need to understand what was happening. The lights flickered once more, and this time, they went out completely. In the darkness, he could hear footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps approaching. He tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. The footsteps grew louder, and then, suddenly, the lights flashed back on. Julian turned around, and his blood froze. There, standing at the other end of the car, was a figure cloaked in shadows, its face hidden beneath a hood. Its eyes, however, glowed a ghostly white, and its mouth twisted into a sinister grin. It raised a hand and pointed directly at him. Panic surged through Julian. He stumbled back, crashing into a seat. The figure tilted its head, and before he could react, the train screeched to a stop. The doors opened, and Julian bolted out, his heart pounding. He didn't stop running until he was safely outside the station, gasping for air. The next day, he found out that the subway line had been temporarily closed due to a strange accident, an unexplained incident that left a train empty and damaged, with no passengers in sight. One evening, he confided in his roommate, David, who was an enthusiast of all things paranormal. David listened intently, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and excitement. "You know," he said, "there are trucker horror stories about strange things happening in desolate places, but urban legends about subways? That's nightmare fuel." The comment, meant to lighten the mood, only deepened Julian's unease. The memories of that night felt too real, too chilling, to be just an eerie experience. The next day, Julian tried to return to his routine but found himself avoiding the subway altogether. As he waited for a bus instead, he overheard a conversation between two older men. They spoke of ghost stories and the haunting tales of passengers who never made it home. One of the men mentioned the legend of the screaming train, a tale about an old subway line cursed by a tragic accident that left dozens of souls trapped underground. The hair on the back of Julian's neck stood up. Had he become part of one of these chilling tales? Despite his fear, Julian couldn't stop himself from researching. Late at night, under the soft glow of his laptop, he read accounts of subway workers who claimed to have heard the screams of the damned. These chilling accounts painted a picture that matched his experience all too well. The shadowy figure, the ghostly white eyes, and the feeling of an icy breeze were common threads in stories that had been passed down for years. His hands shook as he read, his mind flooded with images of those lifeless, glowing eyes. One evening, unable to bear the anxiety any longer, Julian decided to face his fear. He boarded the last train of the night, hoping to find some closure. The car was nearly empty, just like before, and the silence was suffocating. As the train moved into a dark tunnel, the lights flickered again. Julian braced himself, his heart pounding, and suddenly, he felt a familiar icy breeze. He closed his eyes, waiting for the nightmare to end. But this time, a soft voice whispered in his ear, "You shouldn't have come back." His eyes shot open, but there was no one there, just the echo of haunting whispers and the suffocating darkness that refused to let him go. This story is about the Phantom Commuter. Diana had always been fascinated by urban legends, but she never thought she'd find herself at the center of one. She was a university student, often burning the midnight oil at the library. One night, she boarded the subway to head back to her dorm. It was late, and the car was mostly empty. Only a few stragglers sat scattered throughout, each lost in their own thoughts. Diana took a seat and pulled out her notebook, trying to distract herself from the unease that always accompanied these late-night rides. The train lurched forward, and she settled in, her pen scratching against the paper. But after a few minutes, she noticed something odd. A man in a suit was seated across from her. His head was down, and he wore a fedora that shadowed his face. There was nothing particularly strange about him, except that he never moved. Even as the train jostled over the tracks, he remained eerily still. Diana tried to ignore him, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her. At the next stop, more passengers got on, and the train doors hissed shut. Diana glanced up and noticed that the man in the suit was now sitting closer to her, though she hadn't seen him move. Her heart skipped a beat. She brushed it off as her imagination, but she kept an eye on him. With each stop, he seemed to be getting closer, yet she never saw him change seats. The fear clawed at her, but she stayed quiet, telling herself she was just tired. Finally, the train reached a station where a crowd of people got on, filling the car. Diana felt a moment of relief, thinking the presence of others would ease her anxiety. But as she looked around, she realized the man was gone. She breathed out, thinking she was in the clear, but her relief was short-lived. The train entered a dark tunnel, and the lights flickered. In the dim flashes, she saw the man again, standing at the far end of the car, staring directly at her. His eyes glowed red, and his mouth was twisted into a hideous grin. The lights flickered once more, and he was gone. Diana's chest tightened, and she struggled to breathe. She grabbed her bag and rushed to the nearest door, determined to get off at the next stop, even if it wasn't hers. When the train pulled into the station, she practically threw herself out the doors, collapsing onto the platform. She looked back just in time to see the man standing in the window, tipping his hat to her as the train disappeared into the darkness. Shaken, Diana reported the incident to the station security, but they found nothing on the cameras. No man in a suit. No glowing eyes. Just her, sitting alone, terrified. To this day, she avoids the subway, haunted by the Phantom Commuter who seemed to defy reality. The subway had become a place of fear, and she started hearing stories about others who had encountered the same apparition. These chilling tales described encounters with a man in a suit who would vanish as soon as you got too close, his presence leaving behind a cold, suffocating dread. Diana found herself spiraling, reading online accounts from people who claimed to have seen him. The eerie experiences matched hers almost exactly, and the stories were enough to send a shiver down her spine. One evening, while studying late in the library, Diana overheard a group of students discussing paranormal events. She mustered the courage to join the conversation, sharing her own ghost stories about the Phantom Commuter. The group listened intently, one of them mentioning that they had heard of similar events classified as animated horror, stories that almost seemed too vivid to be real. They whispered about the idea of trapped spirits, souls caught in the endless cycle of their final moments, turning into real nightmares for unsuspecting commuters. A friend of hers, Alex, was intrigued and suggested they try an experiment. He wanted to go back to the subway with Diana to confront the ghost and capture evidence. Diana hesitated, the thought of reliving that nightmare fuel making her stomach turn. However, curiosity got the better of her, and she reluctantly agreed. Armed with cameras and recording equipment, they ventured into the underground labyrinth, determined to uncover the truth. The air was thick with anticipation, and every echo felt like a paranormal presence lurking in the shadows. As they waited on the platform, Alex set up his equipment, joking nervously about scary animations coming to life. Diana tried to laugh, but the anxiety was overwhelming. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the station, and the lights flickered. They both froze, and Diana's heart raced as she felt a familiar, bone-chilling sensation. The train pulled into the station, and when the doors opened, Diana couldn't breathe. There, sitting in the car, was the man in the suit, his red eyes gleaming with malice. Alex caught sight of him and gasped, his camera slipping from his hands. Before either of them could react, the man tilted his head and whispered something. Though the words were unintelligible, they sounded like an ancient chant, a haunting echo that made Diana's blood run cold. The doors closed, and the train sped off, taking the apparition with it. Alex and Diana stood in stunned silence, the weight of the encounter pressing down on them. It wasn't just a ghost story anymore, it was a horrifying reality, one that left them questioning whether the man in the suit was ever human at all. This story is about the sleeping woman. Mark was a night owl, often catching the last train home after long shifts at the bar where he worked. One night, after an especially grueling shift, he boarded the train and found a seat near the back. He was exhausted, his eyes heavy, but something about the subway always made him feel uneasy. He chalked it up to the harsh lighting and the constant hum of the tracks. Tonight, however, felt different. As the train pulled away from the station, Mark noticed a woman sitting a few seats away. She was slumped over, her long hair covering her face, and she looked like she was asleep. He didn't think much of it at first, but as the train moved, he realized she wasn't moving at all. Not even a twitch. Concerned, he got up and approached her, intending to make sure she was okay. He gently tapped her shoulder. "Ma'am?" he asked. She didn't respond. He tried again, and still, there was no reaction. Unease settled in his gut. He leaned down, trying to peer through the curtain of her hair, and that's when he noticed something horrifying. Her eyes were wide open, unblinking, and her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. Mark stumbled back, his heart racing. The woman's head slowly turned to face him, and her smile grew wider, stretching her mouth inhumanly. Mark stumbled backward, almost tripping over his own feet. He looked around, but the other passengers seemed oblivious, lost in their own worlds. The lights above flickered, and he heard a soft giggle, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The woman stood up, her limbs moving stiffly, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. She took a step toward him, and Mark felt his blood run cold. The train screeched to a stop, and Mark took the opportunity to bolt out of the car. He ran up the platform and into the station, not stopping until he reached the exit. When he finally dared to look back, the woman was standing in the train's doorway, her smile still stretched across her face. The doors closed, and the train sped off into the tunnel, taking the nightmare with it. Mark never rode the subway again, haunted by the image of the smiling woman who was anything but human. Over the next few weeks, Mark found himself plagued by nightmares, each one more vivid than the last. The dreams were a blend of sleep paralysis and waking terror, where he could feel the woman's unblinking eyes on him, her haunting whispers echoing in his ears. Every time he tried to scream, his voice would fail him, trapped in his throat as if her ghostly presence had stolen it. It felt as though he was being watched, even when he was alone in his apartment, and the fear seeped into every corner of his life. One night, while Mark was attempting to catch some sleep, he awoke to the sound of soft laughter coming from the hallway outside his bedroom. It was a bone-chilling sound, the same giggle he had heard on the train. He bolted upright, his heart hammering, and grabbed his phone. The clock read 3:33 a.m. He knew it was the witching hour, a time said to be rife with paranormal activity. The laughter stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind a suffocating silence. Mark sat there, drenched in sweat, praying that whatever haunted him wouldn't make its way inside. Desperate for answers, Mark began researching ghost stories and urban legends involving the subway. He stumbled upon an article about a string of chilling tales that described a woman with a grotesque smile who would appear late at night, only to vanish without a trace. These stories had been shared by subway workers and weary commuters, each one recounting eerie experiences with the same figure. The legend was known as the Sleeping Woman, a vengeful spirit said to be searching for the souls of those who dared to disturb her rest. Mark reached out to a friend named Tony, who dabbled in paranormal investigations. Tony was thrilled at the chance to explore what he called a real-life animated horror, and he eagerly agreed to meet Mark at the subway station late one night. Armed with recording equipment and EMF detectors, they descended into the dimly lit tunnels. The air was thick with an unsettling energy, and Mark felt a familiar chill run down his spine. The two men set up their equipment, and Tony began speaking into the recorder, asking if any spirits were present. They waited in silence, the hum of the tracks amplifying the tension in the air. Suddenly, the EMF detector lit up, and the temperature around them plummeted. A cold breeze swept through the station, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of haunting whispers. Mark's breath caught in his throat, and Tony's eyes widened with a mix of fear and excitement. Just as Tony raised his camera, the lights flickered, and a familiar, twisted giggle echoed through the empty station. Both men turned to see the woman standing at the far end of the platform, her mouth stretched into that inhuman grin. Mark's legs nearly gave out, but Tony, driven by equal parts terror and curiosity, aimed his camera at her. The woman took a step forward, and then another, her limbs jerking as though pulled by invisible strings. The camera's screen glitched, the image of her face warping into a nightmare fuel of dark, hollow eyes and that grotesque smile. Before Tony could react, the lights went out completely. When they flickered back on, she was gone. The two men bolted out of the station, the echoes of her laughter following them into the night, a terrifying reminder that some horrors are best left undisturbed.